Hello and welcome to Rights of a Free People, a television program brought to you by the local Rhode Island ACLU. Tonight we have a very exciting show for you. My name is CAROLYN MANNIS. I'm on the local and national boards of the ACLU. I'm a volunteer attorney for the ACLU, and I'm an attorney in private practice in Providence. My guests tonight are two outstanding representatives from the State House. We have a freshman phenom. We have Representative Liana Cassar, and we have our stalwart. We have Representative Edith Ajello. We know her as Edie. Welcome today.
Thanks so much.
I'm going to talk about a lot of legislation that impact women. So we have the perfect panel today. We have an all-woman panel. So we're going to talk about things that we hope will happen and things that we hope won't happen in this legislative session. So we're going to jump right in and talk about sexual harassment. Edie, do you want to start us off with some of the legislation that we have now that's going to hopefully help women bring more claims and assert more rights with regard to sexual harassment in the workplace?
Unfortunately, I'm not really up on the details of the pieces of legislation, but they all come out of a commission that Teresa Tanzi chaired during the 2018 session. And that came out of partly the Me Too movement, partly Teresa Tanzi's own experience and some other people's experiences at the State House, and as with the Me Too movement, all over the country, really. But there is legislation dealing with sexual harassment in the workplace and how people can deal with it. One of the pieces of legislation would forbid separation agreements or what is it? What are
non-disclosure?
Non-disclosure agreements being a requirement for hiring for a particular position. So,
and now the reasoning behind that is so that you can't silence a victim.
Right.
So that's one of the things that hold women from going forward and coming out against their accusers is the fact that they might have signed a non-disclosure agreement.
Exactly.
And then there's also, I understand, part of the legislation also will extend the time frame that you can bring a claim.
Yes.
And I would assume the reasoning behind that is so that if you're forced to stay in a job where you're being harassed, once you're able to get out of that position, you'll be able to vindicate your rights. I would assume that's the theory behind it.
Right. I think the effort is to make sure that people who are victims of sexual harassment are not sort of feeling the economic and professional blowback from that. So having an extended period of time makes it so that the women can make a choice about kind of professional development and moving forward without having to compromise kind of their current employment, or it gives them time to do that.
Now, one of the other aspects of the sexual harassment laws that I understand they're looking to change is that it would include more people, such as volunteers and unpaid interns, so that if an unpaid intern is harassed or a volunteer is harassed, that they also would have standing to bring a lawsuit.
Absolutely. And I think it's really aiming for a zero tolerance in the workplace for sexual harassment. And when we carve out different populations to protect or leave unprotected, we put people unnecessarily at risk. But being inclusive makes it more possible to have zero tolerance.
Well, we look forward to following this legislation throughout this session, and hopefully we'll make some headway and perhaps even have some of these bills become law this session. And right in the same vein, we also have equal pay. That's another area where we're trying to balance the playing field.
Sure.
So can you tell us a little bit about the equal pay?
Yeah, I think that the reality, and most people know the figure that women earn 77 cents on the dollar for what a man earns for an equivalent position. There's a more significant impact and loss of earnings for women of color. The effort for pushing for equal pay for equal work would sort of balance the scales and stop disadvantaging women economically, which in the end hurts families and hurts communities.
Now, there have been some changes.
It goes a little further than that, too. It's pay equity for women and minorities. It's allowing employees to compare what they're making. Right now, an employer can say, you, Liana, can't tell Edie what you're making. Edie can't ask you. You can't compare your salaries to see whether you're being paid comparably because you're doing comparable work. Right now, that's legal in the workplace. The Pay Equity Act, as introduced last year, and I believe again this year by Susan Donovan in the House and Gail Golden in the Senate, would make that sort of, make it illegal for an employee to prevent, an employer to prevent employees from comparing what they're getting paid.
Are there federal laws that protect that in the workplace? It's my understanding that there are some federal laws that protect that, and they're along the lines of in the union, in the NLRB, there are laws that prohibit you from being penalized for having discussed your salary. So
I'm not familiar with those, but I think most workplaces also are not, and there is sort of an unspoken and informal prohibition. The action is discouraged, and that lack of transparency leads to perpetuating, where if you go from job to job, you continue, if you started at a low salary, you continue, that sort of has a legacy throughout the career of an individual, and that needs to end as well.
That's another piece of this big bill, that an employer can't, as a condition of considering you for hiring, ask you what you're paid at the job that you're leaving, or were paid at your last job.
Hopefully this one, like the other ones, we would hope has some, sees the light of day and makes it to the governor's desk and hopefully gets signed, because it's obviously 77% and a lower rate for people of color.
Yes.
It's not acceptable.
Not acceptable.
It's not acceptable. So tell us about the tampon tax.
The tampon tax it's not really just tampons. It's feminine hygiene products associated with the menstrual cycle. They're things that almost every woman needs to use for a significant period of her life. There's really no getting around it, and the sales tax on them is an undue burden people feel on women in particular. So the tampon tax repeal would get rid of the sales tax on feminine hygiene products.
And this has been a movement across the country, hasn't it? I think I just heard, I forget which state, but there was a state, I want to say last week, that passed a similar law to this that would end the tax on feminine hygiene products.
Absolutely. And I think one of the legislators in California who advocated for it said, this is not a luxury. This is a biological necessity. So again, disproportionately having an economic impact on women.
Oh, well, doesn't even seem, I don't even know what the counter argument would be.
Right.
I can't even comprehend it. It's like so black and white.
Absolutely.
I mean, I would hope that it would pass. Is this the first year that it was introduced?
No, this will be at least the third.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it's taken so long.
There is a small fiscal impact. Not collecting that sales tax means that
They need to find something else to substitute.
Need to find something else to substitute or something to cut. Yep.
So, Now let's talk about voter ID. Voter ID laws have been around now, and they've been hampering people from voting.
Sure. The best way for our democracy to work is to have as many people as possible voting and participating in our elections, and voter ID laws really discourage that, frankly. You know, we've seen in states throughout history that Any barrier to voting disenfranchises people, mainly the poor, mainly people of color. Frequently, in this case, the elderly, who may have gone a while without renewing a license or getting a new ID. And it's an undue burden, and it just seems unnecessary at this point.
So what would these new voter ID laws do? Would they get rid of existing voter ID laws?
Repeal the existing.
Right.
The effort now is to repeal our Rhode Island's voter ID.
Have there been any studies done to show the difference in the amount of people who voted under the different?
It's very difficult to compare one election year to another election year. You know, there are different candidates and different efforts to get out the vote. So it's very difficult to tell from year to year whether the voter ID law in Rhode Island or any place is having an effect. But there was some study recently that indicated that there was at least a slight depressing effect on voter turnout. And I've seen it every year that we've had voter ID required in Rhode Island at the polling place, people getting there and realizing that they'd left their driver's license at home because they were walking to the polling place, and the polling place is right around the corner. They've been going to Hope High cafeteria in Providence to vote for years, and very often know the poll workers there, and so simply forgot. My own mother was voting until just the year before she died. She never drove, so she never had a driver's license. She never had a photo ID. And
I think it's interesting too, one of the things that we seem to use all the time for identification is Social Security cards. And back when I first got my Social Security card, it said right on it, not used as a valid ID. And now it's almost required. And it is required in many instances.
it's one of the things you have to have when you go to the DMV to get the real ID.
Yes.
Your an original
Yes.
Social Security card.
And I have no idea where mine is. So hopefully I never have a gap in having my license, because I might never
You'd
get
end up
one
needing
again.
to get one. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be quite onerous, you know, and especially people too, they've changed their names multiple times. Used to be you could just use the number. And I remember taking my daughter to the DMV and they asked for a Social Security card, and I said, oh, here's her number. Oh no, we need the card. So we had to leave and then go back and then come back.
Sure.
And then you know how the lines are at the DMV. So it's amazing that it seems like the people who make these laws think that every person's experience is the same.
Sure.
Like, well, this is what it takes me to get my ID, therefore, everybody's exactly the same.
And so it disadvantages people without resources, whether transportation, whether it's someone who wasn't intending to drive, whether it's someone without the ability to get to the various agencies to get their paperwork. I think those are the voters that we are disenfranchising by producing more barriers, and with a cost. Getting an ID is not free, so it's you know, to some extent a poll tax, even when we think about it, that in order to vote, you have to be able to organize your life and get to the DMV or wherever, and then also get to the polls. And
we're
significant
a very
impact.
mobile society too. People are living in states that they were not born in. People don't stay in Providence from when they're born to when they die, and their children are born there. And there are some people that stay on the same street in the same house through generations. But many, many people in Rhode Island and around the country grew up in different states in different parts of the country, and they have lost their birth certificate if they ever had it themselves. And so going back to that community to get a birth certificate in order to get a photo ID when you don't need it for driving is quite a burden to put on someone. And
even in Rhode Island, where it's fairly densely populated, we don't have the best public transportation system, and
Right.
some people who
Right.
live in more rural areas, it's a real hardship on them
Absolutely.
to go into the city, down into Providence.
Right.
I remember there was a joke, I grew up in Burrillville, and it was a joke, do I have to drive on 95? I mean, that was like
Sure.
terrorizing to
Yeah.
to people back then. They did not want to, they'd drive all the way to Woonsocket, but they wouldn't drive to
Not on the
Providence. Yeah, they didn't have to get on the highway. So, you know, I think when we think about impacts outside our own, that's when it becomes more clear the impact it can have. And it's not right. Every citizen should have the right to vote.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if it only affects one citizen. It shouldn't be, especially when there's no counter reason why they need those things.
There haven't been instances of people voting fraudulently, saying they were someone they weren't in order to vote. Nothing proven. And I am so tired of hearing that you have to have photo ID to get on an airplane. Getting on an airplane and flying someplace is not a right that we have as citizens.
Right.
In the same way.
No, it absolutely is very different. And the right to vote is supposed to be a fundamental right,
Absolutely.
whereas flying is a luxury,
Yeah.
you know. Just like as we were talking about the feminine hygiene products. It's
Yeah.
like-
Right.
It's
It's not a luxury.
Right.
Sure.
Flying is a luxury. Voting is not a luxury. It's a right. It's a right. It's a human right.
Or a responsibility, even.
Yes.
Right.
There are some countries that it's mandatory to
Right.
vote. And I know there are different debates that go back. I still think we're a free society and you should be able to exercise your right not to vote. But I would still hope that everyone would want to.
Right.
Yeah.
And we certainly would want the majority to vote so that we are sure that our government is representing the majority.
Yes. It's an interesting, when you think about burdening voting to the point where you're not getting a proper outcome. You look at races that come down to a handful of votes.
Sure.
And we had some here the last election. I know we had a couple of elections that came down to like 5 or 6 votes.
Right.
So how
Which
many?
doesn't even represent a percent, you know,
Yep.
where such a small percent of people are making some significant decisions for the whole population. I think we need to be making it easier for people to vote, reducing the barriers. And this would be one way to do it, by repealing that voter ID law.
Now, occupational licensing. This has been a new thing where you go to get a license for a certain profession and they do a criminal background test. And that comes out that when you were 18 years old, you might have done something and then you can't get your license. And it's something you hadn't thought about in 20, 30 years. And now all of a sudden your dream of becoming a daycare worker or a real estate agent, whatever the occupation might be, is shattered because of youthful indiscretion.
I think the motivation behind these licensing requirements for various occupations is good. The aim is to protect the population that's served by whatever this profession is, whether it's children in a daycare situation or what it is. But that someone had a marijuana conviction when they were 18 or 19 and now are applying to be a masseuse. Is that marijuana conviction really relevant? Should that come up on a BCI and it be up to the applicant to decide whether they're going to explain it or try and keep it quiet? There are other crimes that someone might have committed and they've done their time and they've remade their lives, and we ought to be more recognizing that people can remake their lives. They can turn a page and ought to be looking more at the references of someone who's applying for a job or seeking a license, as opposed to the quick, easy thing, which is get a fingerprint and do a background check.
It's interesting too, then you have like a cycle of poverty thing that can happen, and you have that whole, the prisons that are, you know, the school to prison pipeline. It's all part of this big cycle that it's hard to break when there are so many instances where it won't let you out.
Right. Yep. So the inherent bias that we know exists in our criminal justice system, where certain populations are overrepresented from arrest to sentencing to serving time, I think it presents a situation where this attaching the occupational license to a criminal background sort of prolongs the sentence. If someone has been sentenced and they have served their time, we should permit people to be able to rehabilitate and come back and be contributing members of society. Any relevance between a crime and a potential occupational license that may be relevant, sure, but I think very often people have looked to better their lives, and we need to provide them the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, that's the other aspect, is a lot of times there's no connection between the skills you need for that job and whatever it was that the crime was in the past. And it seems like at a minimum, there should be some correlation. Like you could see if you had so many driving violations, you shouldn't be a bus driver. You know, that would make sense, right?
Yeah.
No livery license for.
Right. That would be a clear, you know, or even a taxi driver. If you know, if you've had so many accidents in the last 5 years, you shouldn't be a taxi driver. That makes sense because it's related to the profession that you're seeking. But when they're not even related, and the chances of there being any kind of recurrence is minimal to none, especially seeing you have paid your debt to society, seems unfair to hold that against an applicant who's trying to better their lives.
Right. It's continuing punishment instead of providing opportunity.
I know on the bar exam they have ethics. You have to do character and fitness. And you have to go in for an interview. At least when I did it. I know they still have it. I don't know if it's the same, because there may be too many applicants for them to do it in person now. But there is a character and fitness. And there have been people who sought to challenge that. And I think it goes along with the same laws. You know, like, can they be a lawyer? Do they have the skills to be a lawyer? And we have our own monitoring of the behavior, and I'm sure the people who have not behaved well did not have criminal past. So there didn't seem to be a correlation in that regard.
There's that issue of moral turpitude that's in the law in a number of places regarding licensing or eligibility to work in certain professions. And we tried last year to delete the words moral turpitude in all the places that it appears in people's being eligible for certain professions. Some of our colleagues really thought that it was important that we kept that language there, though it's never defined in Rhode Island law. So we have these words, moral turpitude, and one who is deemed guilty of moral turpitude can be denied participation in some professions, but it's not defined anywhere.
Right, so it wouldn't even be a conviction of a crime. It would just be someone deems that you lack moral turpitude.
Right, which is incredibly subjective.
Right, yes.
Yes.
Well, we also have issues with involuntary commitment. The ACLU, obviously, we're rights of a free people, so it makes sense that we would be against involuntarily committing people.
Yeah, and I think, again, it comes of a desire to be helpful for people who need services, need some sort of rehabilitation or some sort of treatment, but are reluctant or unwilling to seek it themselves. And so this, as I remember, Representative Casey introduced the legislation last year. He's a, I think now retired EMT up in Woonsocket. And this legislation came of his work as an EMT and his work in the community, and seeing in some cases the same individual either drunk or having a reaction to an overdose of an opioid, and in some cases seeing the same person over and over again, and this person needs help, and thinking that perhaps a family member could facilitate that person being committed for help or treatment. And in some cases, I think, as he envisioned the idea, it would also be perhaps law enforcement officer who could find the person in need of help and do a short-term commitment, and then there would be a workup by professionals. But it seems pretty strong.
And so what's the downside of that? So as you said, that's from a place of wanting to help. So give us the argument on the other side, that why shouldn't we do that?
Well, one of the downsides is that, from what I understand, people do best at rehabilitation when they sign themselves in, not when they're committed, not when it's forced on them, but when they have recognized that they have hit bottom and that they need to start doing something different. When they've come to that themselves, as opposed to somebody trying to beat that into their head.
I think the way it seems framed to me is, the problem we're trying to solve is a public health problem. It's in regards to the epidemic of substance abuse. But this solution is one that cuts at individual liberties, as opposed to thinking about creating a system for which individuals with substance abuse issues can easily access resources. Very often people are stuck in a cycle because there are not resources in their community, or there are underlying mental health issues or other health issues. And so, unfortunately, this attempt at solving a larger problem ends up undercutting individual freedoms, which is of significant concern.
Yes.
Another piece of it was that we don't have enough beds. We don't have enough rehabilitation available for the population who are now seeking it. So to be committing people who aren't as likely to be helped.
And I think, lastly, and we're going to close on this note, there's also the fear that the people who call the police are going to stop calling the police for fear that they'll have their loved one committed against their will. Yes. I want to thank you both for this very interesting and enlightening discussion about a lot of legislation that's happening right here in Rhode Island. So if you're interested in any of these legislations, call the ACLU office, contact us by email, send us smoke signals, anything. We're having our 60th year anniversary. Look for our events coming up. We have one in March, I think March 14th at Brown University, a panel on media and the First Amendment. We have one in April coming up, so watch your news flyers. I want to thank you on behalf of the ACLU, Representative Ajello, Representative Cassar. Please come back and talk to us, and come fill out at the end of the legislative session. Let us know what we need to do to make it better and what we can be happy passed in this legislative session.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.